it's Silver, and today I'm here to talk to you about the different levels of external awareness an alter can be at within a system. For example, I think it's commonly known that at any one point, not every alter within a system is fronting. Usually there's a couple people at front and a couple people who aren't fronting. But the thing is, it ends up being a lot more complicated than just someone fronting or someone not fronting, and that there's an entire spectrum of how aware an alter can be of external events that are happening, and how close they can be to this idea of fronting. And to really understand the lived experience of many DID and OSDD systems, you have to have a much broader conceptualization of what being aware of the front, or being close to the front, means for systems to really know what their lived experience is like. Because rarely, if ever, is it stagnant with one person at the front and everyone else completely tuned out. In reality, systems are dynamic, and different alters' conscious perceptions of the external world is always shifting. And today I'm going to do my very best job to try to package that all up in an understandable format. And to do that, I've drawn a diagram. And the first thing I'm going to do with this is explain what this diagram is. As you can see, the first line that I've drawn up here is labeled the front. This is going to metaphorically represent when an alter is in active control of the body, which means they are controlling what the body does, and they're controlling the primary train of thought. And with that, the closer a line is to this fronting, the closer an alter is to actively controlling the body, and the more aware that alter is to the external world. When you are fronting, you are the most aware of what's externally happening because you're in direct control of the body and how the body is interacting with that external world. Obviously, you could be dissociated and not have a good one, but still in that dissociative circumstance, the alter that is fronting has a higher external understanding of the world compared to the rest of the alters. Our next line under fronting is labeled co-con, which is short for co-conscious. So when an alter is co-conscious, an alter is kind of like hanging out right in the back of the head, observing everything that's going on and making chatter with the alters who are fronting if there's an alter in the front. Co-con is a great place for internal communication, internal conversations, internal dialogue to exist. It's very obvious when an alter is in co-con, and the alter that's in front can often feel alters who are in co-con. Our next line I label observing. This is a state that for us Montana hangs out in a lot. When an alter is observing, this alter is still aware of what's happening externally, but isn't quite close enough to the front to make conversation and actively interact with any fronting alters. So all this alter can really do in this observation state is watch the world pass by from a distance, and if needed, then they can move closer to the front or further from the front depending on the situation. The next line after observing is in headspace. Once you've hit this in headspace range, then alters are generally not aware of what's going on in the front. There's a little bit of overlap between observing and headspace for alters who can be in the headspace but are still aware of what's happening in the external world. But for the majority of this headspace line, alters who are in the headspace are unaware of what's going on outside and exist primarily in the internal world. After the headspace line is dormant. When alters are dormant, sometimes they don't even appear in the headspace, or they could be in the headspace but just sleeping. This is the farthest level from the front, and this is also the most removed from being aware of what's happening externally. Often when alters come out of dormancy and they come back to the headspace or come to the co-con, they don't know what's gone on in the past couple of months since they've been fronting, and are overall unaware of external circumstances. And now to show how this diagram works, we're going to take this little magnet right here, and we're going to use it to represent an alter. Throughout a day, an alter could be fronting, or they could move into co-consciousness, or they could just be observing throughout the day, or the alter could be in the headspace. And as the day progresses, the alter can bounce back and forth through all these lines, shifting closer to the front or further from the front. And that brings up my next important point. Oftentimes when things like this are talked about, they're talked about as very individual lines, that the alter bounces directly from the front to the headspace, or the alter bounces from the headspace to observing, and that this intersection doesn't exist. But that's actually not true. This whole thing is a spectrum. Alters can come from the front, and they can be any degree of fartherness from the front. They don't directly have to be on this observation line. They can be halfway through observation and halfway through co-consciousness. They could be kind of both observing and kind of in the headspace. They could be just barely co-con and every now and then push a tiny thought into the minds of whoever's fronting. Or they could even be partially fronting and partially co-con and bounce back and forth between having control of the body and hanging out in the co-consciousness. There's no limit on how fast or how slow this process of moving between the different levels takes for specific alters. It varies alters to alter and system to system, just like practically everything else with this disorder. To make this even more complicated, systems don't exist with just one alter. You can take multiple alters and plot them anywhere else on the board. You can have multiple alters observing, you can have multiple alters in co-consciousness, or even you could have multiple alters in the front controlling the body at the same time. And when you're part of a system, these alters all appear at different distances from the front, randomly in between places you can't quite pinpoint, like between headspace and observation, and anywhere else they could be at any point during the day. And on top of multiple alters being on multiple different lines, these alters are constantly shifting, one dropping down, moving up, multiple alters moving at the same time, except for the fact that I only have one hand and can only move them at one at a time myself. But these are constantly in shift, constantly in different dynamic ranges of where these alters could be in correspondence to how close they are to the front. And even further, all of this, where each alter at any point of the day is in correspondence to the front, all affects the system's overall memory. For example, if you have these two alters, green and purple, up here in the front, and you have this white circular one and this red one in co-consciousness, but the rest of the alters are either in the headspace or dormant, these four alters up here will remember and connect with the external events the most at the point where the system configuration is like this. But as moments change, maybe the purple one stops fronting an hour later, and this blue one comes up and is observing, then the purple one will remember the next moment less, and the blue one will remember the moment more. This is why internal communication is so important among systems, because you're never sure who's going to be in the front or who's going to be in the headspace. It all varies situation to situation and is constantly changing throughout the day. And as an individual alter, as me, Silver, up here in the front, sometimes I don't know where the rest of my system is. Say I know all these alters exist, maybe I don't know where this white one is at this moment, or this purple one, or this green one. And these are the only alters where I know where they are. These alters that I just pulled off could be anywhere. And the thing is, sometimes I'm not able to figure that out. And you just kind of have to accept that they're there, and you have to ask later, were you here? Do you remember this memory? How did you feel in this moment? And as you can expect, sometimes this can be confusing and overwhelming for alters and systems. And honestly, it kind of is. The only reason that it's not anymore is because I live with it every single day. That every single day people are shifting around on here. People are constantly shifting who's in the co-con, who's in front, who's in the headspace, who's observing. And while there are ways to predict what configuration this might be in at any possible moment, you don't know from the start. And that's why there's therapy. This is actually a really huge part of therapy, both in one, being able to know if you're fronting where everyone else is, checking in with your body and your mind to be like, hey, who's around? Who's in co-con right now? Hey, who's observing right now? And two, to increase capacity and get more alters closer up to this being aware of the front. Because when more alters are really close to this fronting area, then everyone has a better grasp on external events that are happening. It makes sharing memories and sharing thoughts and sharing communication much easier over the system. And this is obviously a very long progress, getting everyone up closer to the front and closer to communicating with each other, but it's a process that's really worth it. And there it all is. I hope that kind of made sense, at least a little bit. And I promise, living it is just as confusing sometimes as I think this video will be. If you have any questions at all, put them in the comments and I will pin anything that helps make this video a little bit more clear. So I hope this video illuminated a couple things for you and helped communicate what internal system life is like on a day-to-day basis. And with that, I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day.